is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
If you're guest list, welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. We're a church, obviously, and the way we think about things is through this idea of gathering and scattering. And really where that comes from is our bent and passion that there's really a couple ways to give expression to Jesus and who he is and what the kingdom's all about. And so we value Sunday morning for some of the obvious advantages of inviting us into community and inviting us to connect, hopefully, with God and his word and worship and wrestle with him and what his dreams for the world really are. And then we work really hard to value those other 6 days, recognizing that just because you don't work for a church or volunteer within a Christian organization during those other 6 days does not necessarily mean that you're not serving God and his kingdom. And we're working really hard to remind ourselves that life is pregnant with opportunities to serve God and to put a towel over our arm and matter in his name. You like that use of the word pregnant? It's a good one, huh? Yeah, that's spontaneous. Someday I'm going to have a lectern, and then I won't say stupid things like that. But until then, you're stuck with pregnant with opportunities. And I'm just going to warn you, this week I worked on a new preparation style, and it turns out it doesn't work. So you'll have to bear with me this week. Anyway, that's who we are, as we like to gather and scatter. And to that end is this deal that we're doing on Saturday. We've been thinking for months that maybe foster kids are a way that we can drill down in our community, particularly as it relates to orphans and widows. And we recognize that they're not everyone involved there, but as we try to translate God's heart for the orphans and the widows and the oppressed in our culture, we think that may be one of the better ways. And so Sarah has been working with the state to just communicate with foster families and go, hey, so what needs do you have? Whether that's you're just overwhelmed and getting leaves out of the gutters, or whether that's organizing a sewing room, or maybe there's stuff that like plumbing and some heavy construction stuff. So holler if you'd like to be a part of that. There's a sign-up sheet at Guest Central. You can holler at us through the app. There's lots of ways to communicate. We think that we can keep 40 or so people busy. And what we're going to do is we'll be in contact this week. We're going to kind of divide you up in teams, and we'll go out 2 by 2. You know what I mean. And we'll just serve these families, and we'll be done by 1 o'clock. And by the time the day's over, you'll have watched the Grizz lose another football game and feel like you didn't even miss anything that day. That's the way I roll, because I didn't go to either one, so I can just make fun of whichever one's the worst. But I kind of like them both. Anyway, also on the scattering note, maybe you're someone that's new to the culture around here, and there's this desire to connect relationally. And again, we try to really organize ourselves around serving, and so we work to limit the number of midweek kind of ministries or opportunities in an effort to go like, no, we don't want to be so busy. And so if you're looking to connect relationally, scattering opportunities are one way. We'd encourage you to be a part of that. The other is our Sunday morning teams. And there's 4 or 5 of them, guest services and technical and the band and setup and tear down and kids. And there's some really neat things happening in the kids realm. So if you've been toying with the idea of serving kids and not really sure, very excited about Bridget and the leadership she's bringing and kind of the next phase of Narrate Kids. And so don't hesitate to holler if you'd like to be a part of that. This morning, what I want to talk about is like what goes into having a strong heart. The human heart, right? They say that it's the strongest muscle in our body. Of course, it weighs the average human heart about 10 pounds. I'm told this is pretty close to actual size because they say it's about the size of your fist. It beats 100,000 times a day. 100,000 times a day, which means that if you live till you're 80, that's almost 3 billion times your heart will do its thing. It's the command center of our cardiovascular system, and most of us, all of us, I'm sure, understand that. But what I want to explore this morning is what's fascinating to me is how the medical world and the psychology world is really beginning to toy with and even affirm what Scripture's been saying for thousands of years. That the heart is more than just a physical instrument, that it's in charge of more than just our cardiovascular system, but that it's integrally connected to our emotional centers. That you have an emotional part of your brain, and your heart is a part of that highway, that when you mess with one, you really mess with the other. One study I read, I didn't read the study, I read the guy who read the study. That's the way I roll, but you sound smarter if you say you read the study. Put out by the New England Journal of Medicine. They just simply did a study where they looked at the effect on concentration and several different emotions before and after bypass surgery. And what they found is that a person's ability to concentrate and think and their emotional health in general changed dramatically after bypass surgery, and that effect stayed in place for years, up to 5 years that the study went. So what does it take to have a strong heart? That's really my interest, but I'm not really all that interested in like re-talking about some of the stuff we've already talked about. Lindsay's done a great job of talking about like physical health stuff in the past year or so around here, but like how do we have a strong heart when it comes to our emotions? Emotional health it seems, this growing conversation, and I think that's really where we're at in this current series. If you've not been with us, we're in a series called Mind, Heart, and Soul, and really the jumping off point of that series is to acknowledge that sometimes life confronts us with things that we're not strong enough to handle, or at least that's what we feel. Divorce, death, disease, job loss, financial difficulty. Like sometimes we have no choice but to face things, and the overwhelming cry of our heart is, I can't handle this. Though we probably never say that out loud to anyone else. And at other times, there are these opportunities presented to us. A new business venture, the opportunity to move, the opportunity to go back to school, to take a different job, maybe to have another child. That venture's not coming my direction ever, but like there's these ventures that are presented to us, and at the same time, if you've ever started a business or went back to school or done anything where you got to make the choice to take a risk, you can appreciate that sometimes it's really easy to dream about going back to school, but the night before, you're overwhelmed with just how like anxious you are and difficult that's going to be to follow through with what you've committed to. And what we've noted is that Jesus, one of the things he said, and he said it so quickly and it's so easy to just kind of summarize it, but he said like, it's important that you love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And what we've been exploring is that if perhaps Jesus wasn't the smartest man to ever live, not only was he God, but maybe he was extraordinarily intelligent, and maybe he was a little before his time in his understanding that your personhood is comprised of a few different things: a heart, a soul, a mind, and a body. And that to be well, if you want to get holistic, is to really begin to analyze like, okay, so how well am I in my mind, and how well am I in my heart, and how well am I in my soul? So we spent a couple weeks talking about the mind. We talked about thinking simply and thinking expectantly. This morning I want to start talking about the heart. And namely, here's the one thing, lest I lose you because I lost myself first service. Here's what I want to explore is like, what if there's strength in weakness? What if, when it comes to our heart and our emotional health, what if one of the healthiest things, one of the greatest sources of strength is to confess a weakness? Counterintuitive to our culture, but what if that's the way it works? Think of Bill Wilson, a guy who in 1935 was a stockbroker and a struggling alcoholic. Bill Wilson in 1935 in Akron, Ohio, met with another guy who was a surgeon and also an alcoholic. And they sat down, and for the first time, they held what was called an AA meeting. They didn't call it that, but Bill Wilson came to be the founder of AA. I mean, just stop and think about the power of things like AA and NA and other groups that now help people with sexual addictions and even codependency issues. Like, just stop and think about how counterintuitive the whole system is. Like, they say 2 million people a day attend an AA type meeting. The AA is in 150 different countries. There's 100,000 different groups. In Helena alone, if you wanted to go to just an AA meeting, you would have 81 different groups to pick from. It's a phenomenal movement. There's no budget, there are no dues, there are no buildings. There's only one thing required: that when you plop down on the seat, you're willing to acknowledge your most glaring weakness. It's the only requirement. It's the only thing, and yet it's changed millions of lives. Could it be that AA, it offers some commentary to all of life? That it reflects something that God's been talking about from the very beginning, this idea that when we hide weaknesses, we actually become more weak. Whether that's an addiction or any other number of weaknesses, but when we hide them, it actually makes us more weak. And when we acknowledge them, or what the ancients have called confess them, we actually become more strong. There was a doctor, another study that I read about, but I feel like I read, Dr. Corvin. His interest, he worked for Northeastern University, don't even know where it's at, just like to plagiarize. But his interest was the disconnect between who I am, or who I think I am and who I really am. He really wanted to study what happens when someone thinks that they have these character traits, but they don't. Or even more so, what he was interested in, what happens when someone lies to themselves over and over and over again and won't own up to a character flaw. And so he picked a group of 130 people. He started following them in infancy, followed them well into their 20s. And what he would do periodically was he would have them just take a survey, if you will, and just kind of observe, like, here are the strengths and weaknesses of my character. He was really interested in things like how you responded to frustration, how dependable you were, things like that. He would ask people, will you just rate yourself? Comment on your own character. And then simultaneously, he would take family members and friends, coworkers, like people close to these people in the study, and he would ask them to partake in the same survey for them. So they're filling it out for their buddy, for their daughter, for their spouse. Now, what he found, of course, was that there are two groups of people with some variation or on a continuum. That there are those people who have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and they're willing to acknowledge them. And it's no news to their friends what their strengths and weaknesses are. And their friends are willing to acknowledge them. But then there's another type of person who isn't willing to admit their weaknesses, who isn't willing to acknowledge their brokenness. But nonetheless, their friend still sees them. Their friend is still aware of what their character flaws are. He then dug down another layer and he went, okay, so for those people who are completely unwilling to acknowledge their weaknesses, how does that flesh out? And what he found was there were some pretty predictable similarities. That for people where there's this refusal to acknowledge the obvious, they tended to be incredibly moody people. They tended to be incredibly anxious people. They tended to be incredibly socially awkward people. If it feels like I'm describing myself, I've already figured that out. In fact, they found that people who fall into this habit, that they're distant relationally. And what Dr. Corvin goes on to explain, or his hypothesis or thesis or whatever it would be in medical terminology, his theory was that when you set out to maintain a lie about yourself, you necessarily have to run off anybody who challenges that lie from time to time. And so you can go months, and you might even be able to go a year or two with somebody, but eventually your brokenness is found out by them, and eventually they challenge you on that brokenness, and when you are confronted with that moment, you have a decision. Acknowledge the brokenness or lose the friend. In fact, one of the other similarities that they found in people who refuse to acknowledge weakness is that their friends described them as incredibly arrogant and patronizing. Now, well, what is that saying? Well, in some way, it's saying that there might be some short-term benefits to denying your weaknesses, but in the long term, the social implications, they're pretty dramatic. In other words, denying your weaknesses makes you more weak. And yet here's an issue that, like, none of us gets to point the finger, right? We're all prone to this very temptation, much like our boy Kramer.
Well, look at this, Mickey. His pants are falling apart, huh?
You know, when I first met you, Kramer, you used to wear jeans all the time.
Yeah, well, I was a different man then.
With a different body.
Hey, I got the body of a taut, preteen Swedish boy.
I don't know.
Now, what are you thinking? You think that I'm not able to wear jeans anymore? Is that what you're saying? Because if that's what you're saying, Jerry, I'll go and I'll buy some jeans. I swear to God, I will. Don't think I won't, Jerry. All right. That's it.
What'd you get there?
Yeah, I bought dungarees.
Kramer, they're painted on.
The slim fit.
Slim fit?
Yeah, they're streamlined.
You're walking like Frankenstein.
I think before we point fingers, we got to acknowledge that, like, we're all really capable of this, right? Like, we're all here capable of hearing the same criticisms over and over and over again, and yet telling ourselves that they're wrong and they're wrong and they're wrong and they're wrong. This is, we can all do this. Like, check out this poster. What matters most is how you see yourself. I think in some ways we can see why we step into this temptation to not deny our weaknesses, because we live in a culture that is so self-absorbed with self-esteem that, I mean, what is the message of that? Is it not like it's okay if you see yourself as better than you are? It's okay if you see yourself as stronger than you are. It's okay if you think you can sing, even if the whole world thinks you can. All that matters is that you can sing, right? Listen to this. There's this guy, I don't know who he is, but he's apparently a somewhat popular self-help author who wrote AT&T, the largest 4G network. Screensaver. He said at some point, oh yeah, maybe I could just read it off the screen, but I won't. The best thing about Jesus was that he had a mom that believed he was the Son of God. Imagine how different the world would be if all of our moms thought that way. Really? Like, I know this is kind of, raw meat, so to speak, but like, is it really the solution to our world's brokenness and our individual brokenness that more of us would think of ourselves as God's gift to the earth? I don't say this to throw stones, because I think there's a lot to be said about self-esteem, and obviously the pendulum can swing in the other direction as well. But it is to say this, that if you're going to be a person who decides to step in and take seriously your weaknesses, rest assured, you're going to go against the flow of our culture. Like, it's not normal. It's not the way things go. It's much more normal to take truth and twist it and align it in a way that's convenient to the image that you want to maintain about yourself. That's normal. Self-delusion is something we can all do. Listen to these just kind of funny anecdotal comments about self-delusion. 94% of university professors think they're better at their jobs than their colleagues. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but just think about that. Like, we're talking the majority. There's a mathematical limitation to that. 94% say they're better than their colleagues. 70% of college students think they're above average in leadership. Only 2% think they're below average. This isn't Harvard. This isn't Stanford. This is like every university, I don't know who was surveyed, but only 85% of medical students think it's improper for politicians to accept gifts from lobbyists. 85% think it's improper to accept them from lobbyists, but only 46% think it's improper for physicians to accept gifts from drug companies. So you start getting into the delusion. A study of medical residents found that 84% thought their colleagues were influenced by gifts from pharmaceutical companies. Only 16% thought they themselves were similarly influenced. So this is an easy one to point fingers. But the reality is it's something we're all prone to. And the question we're asking is, what if there's strength in admitting weakness? Shakespeare said it this way. I really like it. He said, God has given us one face, and you make for yourself another. I was going to preach in this weekend, but decided that it might be distracting if I did this the whole time. I don't even know. Somebody probably knows what the history of this thing is, but God has given us one face. We give ourselves another. What if there's strength, real strength, emotional strength, the strength to endure things you didn't know you could in acknowledging a weakness? And isn't this something that Jesus talked a great deal about? Listen to this in Matthew 23. I'm going to read a lot of familiar texts this morning and hopefully maybe spin them a little bit or cause you to think afresh about them. Woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. An often quoted text, right? But it strikes me that when Jesus says things like this, and particularly when he calls out the Pharisees, because they're so objectified in our theology, it really leaves us a couple options. We can picture ourselves kind of behind Jesus, looking over his shoulder, pointing at the very people he's pointing at, condemning the very people he's condemning. That's one option, right? Or we can take a very different position in the story, and we can position ourselves right next to the Pharisee and see him graciously looking at us and going, hey. Like the Pharisees, these are my friends. He grew up with the Pharisees. He studied with the Pharisees. He didn't hate the Pharisees. This was more like, in my opinion, he challenged them the way you might challenge the people closest to you. The other option is that you stand next to those very people and you understand that Jesus is saying something to you, that there is a human propensity to put a happy face on our weaknesses and not acknowledge that we have them at all. Come to think of it, Jesus talks a great deal about this. Some would even call it confession. And I think one of the questions that we can ask is, like, why has God historically been so passionate about confession? Is it so that he can keep us under his thumb? Like, is the point of confession to remind you of how much you need the cross? In some sense it is, but is it limited to that? Or is confession just this observation that in acknowledging a weakness, there is incredible strength because of the cross, yes, and because of the way God has made us? Listen to Luke 18. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus offers some commentary. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves, you might say, who deny weakness, will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I mean, is the point of this story that Jesus likes tax collectors more? Is the point of this story that Jesus doesn't like religious people? Or is the point of this story that Jesus sees tremendous potential in life in people who are willing to acknowledge their weakness? It's really a story about posture, isn't it? One person who shows up before God, and there's no possible way he could really think he was perfect, is there? I think it's him jumping on a treadmill that assumed he had to project himself as perfect. And another person who refused to step inside that system. In Mark 2, Jesus says this, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Again, so does that mean that there's no place in God's kingdom for righteous people? Well, that's silly. That's what it's all about. That's what the cross accomplishes. Isn't it? Isn't it that the moment you set out to be righteous, which turns out is something probably everyone in this room has set out to do, the moment you set out to care about your character, the moment you set out to care about how people think of you and who you are as a person and what's on your headstone, the moment you make that your goal, you're prone, aren't you, to managing that goal by denying the things that challenge it? It strikes me that this whole mentality is, I guess I've never seen this before in Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees, that it's a warning because they started with an incredible desire to live lives pleasing before God, to live lives where they served other people, to live lives where their character mattered. And isn't Jesus saying, hey, that goal, it's become an obstacle for you? Because you've now so committed yourself to that goal that you're willing to cheat on your taxes to make it happen. You're now so committed to that goal that you're willing to lie to yourself. We're all willing to do that, aren't we? That's the challenge. The player, the athlete who sets out to make it big, in the beginning, they don't have performance-enhancing drugs. That's not an option. But the goal becomes so big that they're willing to entertain anything in order to accomplish the goal. I think that's what Jesus is warning us here. I'm not so naive as to think that this desire is limited to people who go to church, but I think we're more prone to it than most because you care about your character, and he's going, be careful. It'll take you out from the backside. In another story, it's about this woman, and you've probably heard this story, but hear it again. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They're using this as a question to trap, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. You're going to call her out on your faults? Let's talk about on her faults. Let's talk about yours, in other words. He stooped down. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Now, did they go away because they no longer saw her sin as sin? Or did they go away because they saw the playing field was level and they had their own stuff and they were too focused on hers? Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. Again, what makes this woman such an admired character in the gospel accounts? Is it because Jesus somehow offers preferential treatment to women? No. Is it that Jesus is somehow not at all attuned to sexual sin? Like, is adultery something that he doesn't even entertain? What's the issue here? Isn't the issue that her stuff, like her brokenness, it's out there? And isn't he saying, hey, you are staring at a really great opportunity. Your weakness is exposed. So deal with it. Move forward. He doesn't say to her, hey, now go live your merry life. He doesn't say like, don't sweat it. He says, go now and leave your life of sin. There's an opportunity to own your stuff here. And when you think of it like that, the scriptures are riddled or pregnant with such people, aren't they? Like Moses comes before the burning bush at 80 years old, and God says what? Go. And he says what? Who am I? Gideon. I love the way Gideon puts it. God comes to Gideon and says, hey, you're my guy. I need you to lead my people. And he says, pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. To which God says, I'll be with you. You see this story in Saul's life, the first king of Israel. Though he eventually fell because of his arrogance, his initial response when Samuel anointed him and said, you're going to be the king, was what? No way. Like, I'm from like the worst tribe. Like, my family's weak. There's no way I could be the guy. Even Peter, it seems, when he was first confronted with the idea that Jesus was more than just an amazing human, that he was God, his response, Luke says, is this. When Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. Like, you see throughout Scripture that when people acknowledge weakness, that becomes their strength. Another study was referenced about a doctor who took a group of people who became recently unemployed, men and women. And he was studying emotional intelligence and self-awareness and things like that. And so he took half of the group and he asked them, they agreed that they would spend 20 minutes every day journaling their feelings. You can imagine that the men were thrilled, but nonetheless, so stick with me. Like, they agreed that for 20 minutes a day, they would just document what they were feeling. At the back end of his study, those people that did that didn't struggle with anger. They were emotionally more healthy, and almost 201, they found a new job more rapidly. What is that? Is it not that in confessing weakness, we become strong? You know, the Titanic, it's been well documented, it set out to not have to be unsinkable. They say that no expense was spared. In fact, I just read this week that back office talk was that not even God could sink the Titanic. So proud were they of its lack of weakness that on the day of the maiden voyage, as I've read, the reports weren't even read. There was no research even done about what type of obstacles they might face, what the weather might be, what kind of potential hazards they might endure. In fact, they even built lookout towers on the ship, something that would have been normal. I hadn't heard this either. But they built lookout towers, but there were no binoculars provided. And not only that, there was no plan for communication. So there were lookout towers, and there were people that could theoretically climb the lookout towers and look for danger, though they would be looking with their naked eye. And even if they saw something, there was no means of communicating that to the people who could do something about it. Of course, by now, we know how the story ended. And Proverbs seems to say it this way: pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. The other option that's real central in Scripture is the one that Paul points out, and he experienced himself when he says that God reminded him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, Paul says, so that Christ's power may rest on me. What if there's power to being willing to acknowledge the weaknesses? I had the privilege of sitting down in the last few weeks with a guy who I really admire. He's a 20-something guy, and I don't get to spend that much time with him because he doesn't live here. Trying to be kind to some anonymity here, even though you're going like, you always talk about these 20-something guys that none of us know. You're a good story maker upper. True story, though. And he's a guy who's done some really bold, really courageous things. I really like him. I really like Christ's role in his life. He just seems like a healthy dude. And so I sat down with him and was excited to do so, and yet was struck subconsciously, like I'm kind of unpacking this now, but by just how energetic he was. I mean, there was just this kind of bounce in his step, which sounds dumb, but you know what I mean. And we talked, and we were talking about different things that we were both doing and just life, and there was this kind of really fun conversation. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we took this like rapid right turn. And he said, oh yeah, so that segues into the next thing I want to talk with you about. I started attending a group for people who were struggling with sexual lust. Whoa. Dude said it with a smile on his face. It blew my mind. And I remember as he's talking about how much help he's getting from this group, and I assume the worst. I mean, it's all, don't get me wrong, like it's all destructive, but like nothing illegal, nothing that involves like women who weren't his wife, like none of that kind of stuff. Stuff that the average person goes like, hey, welcome to America. And he's talking about it with this like pride on his face. And I remember thinking that to myself, like, this is remarkable, because most people would be staring at their shoes right now. And he is looking me in the eye and with a smile on his face talking about how amazing this has been. And it didn't hit me till this week as I was kind of unpacking this whole idea, like, that's exactly what we're talking about. Here's a guy who has owned up to a weakness, and he's more alive than he's been in a while. He's not beat down. He's not shamed. He feels stronger now that he's confronting and dealing with one of his most glaring issues. Like he's alive. I have a friend who is an FBI guy back in Billings, and he told me years ago that it's shocking to him how many times that when they arrest somebody, whether it's for child pornography or a drug crime or whatever, shocking to him how often at the moment of arrest, what he hears is, thank you. Somewhat common, he says. What is that? Is it not the like freedom of it being out there? And now we can move forward. Now we can get well. So I don't know where this lands for you. I recognize that it's kind of heavy. But my hope is that like some of us would deal with some masks from this weekend. Like you wouldn't feel the pressure to maintain something that like we don't expect to be true of you, and neither does anybody else. Like, is there some area, maybe there's a theme of criticism in your life and you just keep pushing it away. You keep finding new friends. It keeps getting reaffirmed. Maybe there's a particular conversation that you've had with somebody and they've called you out on something and you're really wrestling with whether or not you can trust that person anymore. You're really hurt. Maybe it's an opportunity to own that, to recognize God's voice in that. Maybe you can't think of a mask. And honestly, like I don't want this to be the type of culture where we always assume the worst about one another, so maybe that's just kind of where you're at. But the other option is that there's not quiet space in your life. Right? Like I don't know if you ever have this encounter, but sometimes I'll hear things and I'll hear reactions that people had, and I'll go like, well, I've done that, and I'm capable of that. Where it really starts to blow my mind is when you get days and weeks and months removed, and people are still like, well, I'm right. Because I guess what I'm trying to get at there is like I'm capable, just like you're capable of some of the dumbest, most illogical, like most unfounded things. But if you've built quiet space into your life where your phone can't be reached and the internet's not on, and there's just this almost haunting silence between you and the Lord, like that's where God does his work. That's where God goes, hey, remember when you said that? I think maybe you were off there. I think maybe you owe them an apology. Hey, remember this whole deal? I think maybe you need to think about that a little more. The psalmist put it so well when he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. I think that this Christians and Jewish people for thousands of years, they've recognized that there's got to be space in my day where God can just point stuff out. Not that we come before God with our tail between our legs expecting to get beat up every day, but where God can just go like, hey, let's talk about this. Maybe there's not a mass that you need to deal with because there's not space in your life to really think reflectively. Maybe for you, the idea of journaling or spending time alone with God every day sounds really feminine, to which I think the ancients would say some of the best men in the text, it was central to their routine and their rhythm. Finally, maybe you're someone here this morning and you're exploring Jesus and who he is and what his dreams for the world really are and whether or not he's worth your while to follow. And I think on a morning like this, it's real appropriate to talk about, like, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? What does it mean to be saved, if you will? That nothing we do, according to what the church has believed for a couple of thousand years, nothing we do can save ourselves. That confession is central to salvation, that we acknowledge that we are broken as broken can get, and Christ saved us through the cross. So it's not that if we confess enough, we can become perfect. It's that if we confess enough and confess Christ, that we become strong because his Spirit indwells us and leads us. And if that's a conversation you'd like to have with someone personally, I'd love to have it with you, or point somebody who may be even better at having that conversation with you. If that's a decision you want to make, then there's no magical prayer or magical sheet you have to sign. It's an acknowledgement to God in the silence and solitude of your heart. God, I'm in. I receive your forgiveness. And then starting relationships that grow you in that direction. Let me pray. God, I think we're in this series because our desire is to be people who are strong at our core. And there's something rather paradoxical about the suggestion that a great way to gain strength is through the acknowledgement of weakness. So we're just grateful for thousands of years and hundreds of lives that attest to the fact that, like, confessing our brokenness is so central to who you are and what you're about and how you make us whole. Undoubtedly, there's masks in the room that are crushing people. And I pray that you'd give them the courage to deal appropriately with them. And God, I pray that this would be a springboard from which we take a little more seriously this ancient tradition of confession. Not that we come before you looking and expecting to get beat up, but we come before you as our leader and our guide and our life manager, eager for your wisdom and insight into our life, eager to help you, have you help us filter the feedback we're getting. Real grateful, Jesus, for your Spirit. Thanks that we don't have to do this without you in us. We love you. Amen.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.